you guys, there's so much I could say about my friend, Marianne Williamson. She's an author, she's a lecturer, and a passionate activist. She's written 14 books, including 4 New York Times #1 bestsellers. Did you know she's the founder of Project Angel Food, which started during the AIDS crisis? And it's a volunteer food delivery system, giving homebound people food and aid, and people who are also suffering from other life-threatening diseases besides AIDS. And she taught me and millions of people that our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. That's who she is. And now, because she believes that it's time to transform America, she is a candidate for President of the United States. Yeah. She's going to be at the debates. She made all the qualifications, so it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce you to my friend, Marianne Williamson.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Emma, for having me. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, all of you. It's great to be here. I remember, actually, the founding of this organization. I remember Lynn and Norman. It was very much a part of what was happening in Los Angeles at the time. And it was one of those seminal projects that brought the conversation about climate change into the popular dialogue, mainstream consciousness in a way that it had not been before. I look at that arc. I remember when Earth Day was a kind of hippie holiday. You took out your granola and your Birkenstocks and look at what it is today. So first thing I want to say is how much I think has been achieved. I want to talk about how much has been achieved, but then we have to have some very serious conversations about not only what has not yet been achieved, but some of the issues that have to be faced in order to make those achievements happen. And some of those issues are not just external, they are internal as well. First of all, the success has had to do with the fact, as I said, that so many people get it now. I'm one of those people for whom there was never disagreement on my part, but I never was one of those people who immediately that was sort of this dharmic mission the way it has been for many people. I was one of those people that, not that I had to be convinced, but I had to be inspired, I had to be motivated. And of course, part of that came about because the situation just continued to get worse. I remember when Jimmy Carter had solar panels up on the White House. When Jimmy Carter, remember, he was president from 1976 to 1980. He had solar panels up on the White House and talked about the greening that was possible, what solar energy could do, how we had to get off fossil fuels. Now we have to look at that in terms of the tragedy that it represents. Because Ronald Reagan, one of the first things he did was to take down those solar panels from the top of the White House. So when Gina was talking just now about what federal politics, the part that it plays and the part that it doesn't play, even though I certainly agree with Gina, and she's certainly correct and so inspiring in everything she said about so often the new ideas, the new projects coming from the states, as Alexander Hamilton said, states are the laboratories of reform. The issue of federal action and non-action, she's right. It's not a matter of that's where the new ideas are incubated, but let us not kid ourselves. That's where the obstruction happens. And we have to be very clear about that, and it is particularly important that we be really clear about what all that means for us today. So Jimmy Carter, if we had listened to Jimmy Carter, if we had done everything that he said, think about that. It was in the 1970s. That was simply a direction we did not take. And nations, like individuals, learn, however painfully, that consequences matter. That's what growing up is about. You know, we've always been considered a young nation, a brash nation, and that was part of our genius. But we're not the young innocents anymore. Too much has happened. Too many failures, too many tragedies, and too many consequences of our own irresponsibility. I remember in my 20s, that was the age at which I had to learn, however painfully, and I think many people do around that time, that there are actions that produce consequences that sometimes do real harm. And that is what has happened and is happening in the United States, not just in relation to climate change, climate crisis, but in relation to other things as well. So the issue of dealing adequately with the climate crisis, which at that time didn't even have to be a crisis, if we had dealt with it responsibly at the time that was appropriate. The fact that we took the road we took and that another road we did not take has had consequences. And let's be very clear. Those consequences have been devastating. And those consequences are not just devastating in terms of hard data, in terms of facts, or even in terms of things that happen in nature. They've been devastating to people's lives. Last week, I was visiting the longleaf longleaf pine ecosystem in South Carolina. Now, there has been such deforestation of that old growth there, only 2% of it is left. And the reason only 2% of it is left is because of all the logging that has been done in order to sell wooden pellets, particularly sown to Europe, and they were introduced as actually a more functional alternative, as a cleaner alternative. But the biomass and the burning of the biomass is such that it's not. It produces just as much carbon. But it's not an accident that the longleaf pine ecosystem is in one of the poorest, most rural sections of South Carolina. I raised my daughter in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and I assure you what happened to the water in Flint could not have happened in Grosse Pointe. And I think that's extremely important for those of us who are sitting in our very, very nice clothes on our very, very nice chairs at the Montage in Beverly Hills. Because at a certain point, a revolution cannot be fought over white wine and brie. At a certain point, a revolution cannot be fought just because we know things. And it can't be fought just because we communicate things. And it can't be fought just because we mainstream a conversation. We are now living at a point when we need to go further than that. When we need to realize that as much money as Hollywood might have, as much power as Hollywood might have, as many forces as Hollywood might be able to harness and to bring to bear, and as much success as organizations like EMA have done, as much truth-telling as Hollywood has done. I mean, some of the things that the political system, the political establishment refuses to talk about, Hollywood does talk about. And Hollywood deserves to feel very good about that. But Hollywood and all of us, just like any other corner of our society and any other corner of our psyches, needs to look for where we are blind. For as much as Hollywood might say, we can get money together, we can get power together, we can get technology together, let us not kid ourselves. The fossil fuel industry says, oh yeah, well, we can too. And they do. And they laugh at the idea that we think we're going to go all the way in time. You know, I remember the movie Vice, and Vice is certainly an example of one of the places where Hollywood did some truth-telling that was not really deeply being done elsewhere. But didn't it just make you want to just stop and throw up when you saw that Dick Cheney had been CEO of Halliburton? And so I'm running for President of the United States because thank you very, very much, thank you. I'm running for President of the United States because there is a point at which you have to take the argument into the belly of the beast. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, the belly of the beast. And anybody in Hollywood or anywhere else who is so naive to think that just somebody's young and hip and cool, they're going to make the change happen when they themselves have taken $500,000 from the oil companies. Sometimes we have our own naivete. Sometimes we have the places within ourselves where we ourselves need to recognize that what's needed now is a level of personal courage. What is needed now is a level of personal standing forth. What is needed now, particularly, I think, among women, is the recognition and the willingness to endure the consequences of the fact that if we say what really needs to be said, not just what 3/4 needs to be said, not just what 4/5 needs to be said, not even just what 9/10 needs to be said, if we are really going to say what needs to be said, we will not necessarily receive applause. We will not necessarily be seen as nice girls. We will not even be seen necessarily as attractive girls. But you know what? We've all read it. We've all seen the memes. We've all put it on our screensavers. Well-behaved women don't necessarily make history. If ever there was a time for sisterhood, if ever there was a time for each of us to know, if I really say it, if I really do it, if I really go all the way, not everybody will be happy. But you know what? If everything that you're saying gets applause all the time, you're probably not yet saying the right stuff. You know why? Because what we need to say is deeper, what we need to say is more painful, and what we need to say is more necessary than ever before. And that is, if we are really going to deal with climate change, if we're really going to deal with this, we need a fundamental pattern disruption of the political and economic status quo in the United States of America. We have, what we heard in Gina is so typical. We have such geniuses in this country. And this is not just true in the realm of environment either. It is also true in the realm of millions of traumatized American children. It is true in the fact that we have a national defense agenda that is driven more by corporate profits for the defense and the nuclear industries than it is driven by any peace-waging, peace-building agenda. We must face our sickness. Los Angeles gave me my career. And Los Angeles gave me my career because it incubates an integrative perspective on life. It is time for us to have the same kind of integrative, holistic perspective on politics and on societal change that we have on personal change. And that is, it's just like when you go to therapy and every session is lovely and fun, you are not at the right therapist. In order to transform your life, just like if you're going to transform your society, you're going to have to get real, you're going to have to get deep, you're going to have to get honest. And some of what you look at will not be fun to see. We don't have universal health care because it would cut into short-term profits for health insurance companies and big pharma. We don't have common sense gun legislation because it would cut into short-term profits for gun manufacturers. We don't have a peace-building agenda because it would cut into short-term defense profits for defense contractors and nuclear industry. And we're not dealing adequately with the climate crisis because it would cut into short-term profits for the fossil fuel industry. We all know that. But let's look at what has happened. We have one major political party that's been bought hook, line, and sinker by a kind of corporatist agenda. What it is really is a veiled aristocracy. You know, that thing we repudiated in 1776. Because in 1776, the idea that just a few people were entitled. Only a few people were entitled to the goods. Only a few people were entitled to land. Only a few people were entitled to wealth. Only a few people were entitled to wealth creation. Only a few people were entitled to make their dreams come true, to self-actualize that. And some very, very brave men signed the Declaration of Independence. And in the Declaration of Independence, it said that all are created equal. All. And all have the rights to life and to liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And that governments are instituted to ensure those rights. That's America's mission statement. That's where it started, but that's also where it got gnarly, because 41 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were themselves slave owners. That's baked into the cake. That's the dichotomy that is our characterological DNA. We have always been both. Every generation has been both, and our generation, no less than any other, we contain both. We contain those of us whose hearts are ablaze with the possibilities of a society in which anyone can soar and anyone should have a chance, which in this case, among other things, in our time means anyone should be able to have safe drinking water, anyone should be able to breathe, anyone should be able to have food that isn't poisoning them, among other things. But in our generation, just like every other, there have been those who have said, no, we will not be doing that. And usually, because to do so would be inconvenient to their economic purposes. Now, the narrative of American history, however, is that brave generations rose up and brave generations pushed back, and we responded. We responded to slavery with abolition because the people stepped in, not because the political establishment said, let's end slavery, shall we? No, that's not the way it happened. With the abolitionist movement, the people stepped in. And then the fact that women could not even vote, the women's suffragette movement grew up. The political establishment didn't say, oh, let's give women the right to vote, should we? No. The people stepped in with the women's suffrage movement. And then, when there was institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South, with the civil rights movement, the people stepped in. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they're at it again. Or as my father used to say, the bastards are always at the door. But today, it's not a particular institution. Today, it is a mindset. And it is particularly gaslighting because it is a mindset that presents itself as good economics. And it is a mindset that says that market short-term profits for huge multinational corporations, completely unfettered to any sense, not only of government regulation, but any sense of moral and ethical consideration for people of this country, for people of this world, for the animals and for the planet on which we live, simply should be secondary to the fiduciary responsibility to their stockholders. A person who has no sense of ethics, remorse, or conscience, or moral values, no sense of moral responsibility towards other people, is called a sociopath. And when you meet those people, you need to have boundaries. You need to say, stop right there. When you have an economic system that similarly has no sense of morals, no sense of values, no sense of ethics, it doesn't matter. So an indigenous tribe ends there, a forest is cut down there, people can't drink the water over here. When you have that, you have a sociopathic economic system. And with that economic system, just like with sociopathic people, you need to set boundaries and you need to say, stop right there. Yeah, but this is the problem. And this is where you got to figure it out in your mind. A lot of them are nice people. It's not individuals. And a lot of them have houses in Montecito. And I say not Montecito, I mean, I lived in Montecito. Montecito isn't to say we're squaring it off in Montecito. But we have to get real. Are we going to be the generation that they look back on, just like we look back at the people who were the suffragettes and we go, wow, what bravery. We look back at the abolitionists and we go, wow, what bravery. We look back at the civil rights workers and we look back at what bravery. Are we going to be looked back at by people who say, wow, what bravery? Or are we going to be looked at by people who say, wow, were they fooled? Wow, they were so distracted. They were so easy to fool in the final analysis. They were so self-absorbed, they thought they could have it both ways. And that's where we are. That's the decision that each of us has to make in our own hearts. And I believe we can't have it both ways. We have one major political party that has been taken over, hook, line, and sinker, by this kind of corporatist agenda. But we have another major political party that is sort of two categories. One category does stand for fundamental major pattern disruption with the political and economic status quo. All democratic, almost all, certainly almost all democratic policy proposals have to do with assuaging the pain. That is true. However, too many people within the forces of the Democratic Party, while they stand for policies that will assuage the pain, refuse to challenge the underlying forces that make all that pain inevitable. No, you can't play footsies under the table with the fossil fuel companies and then present yourself as some kind of change. And if you do, millions of Americans will smell it. Millions of Americans will realize it's disingenuous. Millions of Americans will not have a historical memory of a time when the Democratic Party stood for doing the right thing no matter what. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we're in trouble like we're in trouble now. And anybody who thinks that we can just beat Donald Trump, I don't know, and all of the corporatist forces that are behind that phenomenon, simply by having someone tough enough to do it, if that's your belief, I believe that's being naive about the nature of the opponent. Donald Trump will eat the half-truth tellers alive. The only way to defeat this president, and this president is not the issue here, the issue is the corporatist forces that is represented by the agenda. When you're talking about an ex-chemical company executive who's head of the EPA, when you're talking about before him, it was an ex-oil company executive that was head of the EPA. The EPA should be headed by a world-class environmental scientist. It should be a magnet for environmental science. It should be a magnet for sustainability expert. There needs to be a president of the United States who gets it. We have 12 years. We have 12 years before action, if certain fundamental action is not taken, then there will be irreparable harm. We need to sequester the carbon. We need to reforest. We need to develop sustainable energy. We need to develop sustainable transportation. We need to deal with the factory farming and the nitrous oxide and the methane gas. Because if we don't deal with that, none of everything else is for naught anyway. The problem is not the people. EMA and the EMAs of the world have been successful. The problem is not that people don't get it. You have millions of people who will be voting in this election for the first time who weren't even born in the 20th century. And so many people who the majority of their lives will not be spent in the 20th century and have no desire to be limited in their lives by the insanity of certain economic principles of the late 20th century. That's not where the problem is. The problem is in Washington. The problem is in Washington, and we absolutely must deal with the fact that the forces, their power there, are such that they have absolutely no plans on relinquishing the power that they have been given. And if all we do is beat Donald Trump in 2020, they will be back in 22, and they will be back in 24, and they will see the election in 2020 as merely a time to regroup, have a few vacations, so that in 22 they can lay it down. I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, the only thing that can beat that, the only thing that can beat a pack of big lies is some big truth. And that's where you and I come in. We need to tell some big truth now, some big truth that the whole thing is so corrupt. We're not talking about just a swamp in Washington. We're talking about an ocean of corruption. We're talking about an ocean of corruption that has been developing since the 1980s, in which short-term profit maximization for huge corporate conglomerates has so become the bottom line of the way our government operates that it has not only corrupted our government, it has hijacked our value system. It's interesting being someone who is old enough to remember when it wasn't always like this. Not that it was ever perfect, but there was a sense in America we were trying, and there was a sense that those of us who were trying, we were going to get somewhere. We had not been so lured in, and we had not only lived in a time where it seemed so impossible that we were asking for too little. That's what's wrong with America today. We've been trained to ask for too little. We've been trained to expect too little. And if we do stand for expecting more, that means we will not always be loved. We will be respected by those whose respect we should most care about, but we will not always be loved. And it will mean that we will have to take the battle out just beyond the hotels in Beverly Hills. It means that we will have to take the battle out beyond even the greatest movies and television. And I'm a big fan of what Hollywood has done. Hollywood is a place, just like they say about fiction. Fiction is sometimes the place where the real truth gets spoken. And Hollywood is sometimes the place, much more than the political establishment, which lays down the real truth. But for whatever reason, and this has been true since, and I have lived most of my life, adult life here, but Hollywood, for whatever reason, even though it is a community of truth tellers, it really gets lured in by some of the most well-versed bullshit artists in politics. Because they come here for a lot of money in Hollywood and they get it. Good people. I'm not talking about anything. I always say I'm on the campaign trail because I'm out there running. And every time I talk about the millions of traumatized American children, every time I talk about the fact that our national security agenda is driven by an endless preparation for war rather than a genuine peace-building agenda, every time I talk about really getting down about racial healing, about racial anxiety, about racial injustice, about paying reparations, every time I get for real, every time I lay it down, I always say, I'm not saying anything every Democratic candidate doesn't know. They're just not naming it. They're not talking about it. You might ask yourself why. And that's where we are. The problem in America is not that the American people don't get it. And the problem in America is not even that enough people within the political establishment don't get it. But when people have taken tens of thousands of dollars from securities of investment firms and tens of thousands of dollars from big pharma, tens of thousands of dollars from chemical companies, tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars from oil companies, what do we expect? I sometimes feel with the American people kind of like when you know a woman and he's not where he says he is at night, but she doesn't know it. So her girlfriends get together like, should we tell her? Because it's kind of a moral thing. Does she have a right to know? The American people kind of know, but the entire country is kind of like an alcoholic family system where the children know there's a lot of stuff that's not being said, and then you're just so happy when you say it. You know, being out on the campaign trail has been so interesting. When I was at the rural county, Marianne County in South Carolina, just last week, where because of the hurricanes, because of Hurricane Matthew, because of Hurricane Florence, people had to leave their homes, and then even when they had to leave their homes, they were told by the state, you can't come back because of the black mold. And then when finally the state said, well, you would be able to come back, but when they finally were able to come back, there were these big yellow notices on the door, and the big yellow notices on the door said, you will not be able to live here due to the fact that this is now a flood area. You will not be able to live here unless you elevate your home. And to elevate these homes costs a minimum of $20,000. Impossible for most of those people. And one woman was saying to me, do you think you could help me get back to my home? I really just want to go back to my home. I've lived there for so long. It's my home. Do you think you could help me go back to my home? And she was saying it to me so much that I said to the mayor, I said, you know, I'd like to see her home. Her home is a trailer. These people want to go back. All they want after these hurricanes is to go back to their homes. And their homes are trailers. Now, this is what I found on the campaign trail. What I found on the campaign trail is I say the same message whether I'm talking to the rich or to the poor. I say the same message whether I'm talking to blacks or whites, Jews, Christians, Muslims, gays, straight. It's an American conversation we have to have. And that is that we're losing our democracy. And our public policy is no longer of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's of major corporate profits, by major corporate profits, and for major corporate profits, at the expense of our democracy, at the expense of us, at the expense of the world, and possibly at the expense of our great-grandchildren. But this is what I found very interesting. The day after I visited the home that this woman wanted to go back to, after I visited the cypress forest, after I visited the longleaf pine ecosystem, after I saw the devastation, after I saw the deforestation, after I talked to so many people, after I talked to the people in rural South Carolina about what had happened to our democracy and how much the hijacking of our democracy was at cause for these storms, was at cause for the fact that this environmental injustice occurred. They're not stupid. They know that the cancer that their daughter got came from a particular factory that would not have been put in a rich neighborhood, and that they, because they had no political and economic power, could not fight it. They're not stupid. And when I spoke to them of those things, they got it because they're experiencing the effects of it. But this is what gives me hope. When I left South Carolina, I flew to New York. And the next night, I was at a small dinner party among people who, by any standards, would be considered masters of the universe. And I told them that story. And they had the same listening. They had the same concern, not because they themselves are affected, but because they care. And that is what I believe about America. We're good people, and we do care. We do. I felt that for a long time. And when Donald Trump's son-in-law said, I said to my father-in-law, we can look at all those angry people and harness all that, make you president. I thought, wow, I see a lot of goodness and a lot of love, a lot of wonderful people. We could harness all that and change the world. So what I feel is that if you take the fact of all the people who have been affected by these things and are being affected by these things, and you join that with those of us who are not in our own personal lives affected, but we know that we will be, any public issue will ultimately get to your private door. Good luck with all that green juice. Good luck with all that gluten-free, because they're poisoning the air. And they're poisoning the air when they're gutting the Clean Water Act and gutting the Clean Air Act and overturning the ban on pesticides that we know harm a developing child's brain. Then we are all in trouble. We have to look at these problems. But if we look at these problems throughout our history, let's look at the problems but identify with the problem solvers. We are the legacy of the great Americans. We should identify with the abolitionists who stepped up and said, enough with that, stop right there. We are the inheritors of a legacy that looked at the suppression of women with two major waves of feminism and the women of suffragette movement and said, and are saying now, that's enough with that, stop right there. And we are the inheritors of the legacy of the civil rights movement, of people who stood up in the presence of segregation and institutionalized white supremacy and said, enough with that, stop right there. And why? because we, the people of the United States of America, say so. It takes a little chutzpah to get there. It takes a little willingness to say it even in the face of those who think that that's going a little bit too far. Hell no, it's not going too far. And if you ever have a moment when you doubt any of this, you might remember what my father said to me all those years ago. The bastards are always at the door, little sister, but you can close it anytime you want. God bless you, everybody. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.